Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. We're not going very far today. We're going to Port Hope, Ontario, which is, 30, 40 miles from here. I don't go there very often, but it's on the way to bigger cities like Montreal and Ottawa. So you go through there on the highway, but I've never stopped. But today we're going to, more than stop, we're going to have a great conversation about something that is very dear to my heart and almost recently dear to my heart. It's become something it's something that I've been interested in a long time, but now I'm sort of obsessed with it. And I've got an opportunity to talk to somebody who makes it his career of doing it. And that is citizens' assemblies. And we are going to Port Hope, Ontario to talk to Peter McLeod. Hello, how are you, Peter?
I'm very well, Meta. Nice to join you.
It's wonderful. Okay, now, as I understand it, we had a brief conversation the other day. You are the head honcho in something called Mass LBP, which is, I gather, a corporation or a co-op or some kind of company that organizes citizens' assemblies and other meetings of the general public in ways that are meant to inform public policy. And that just seems to me an absolutely wonderful thing to do with one's life. So I'd like for you to tell me how you got into it and what is it? Because at first I thought it was like a club or something, but it seems to be more like a business. Tell me first about you and Mass LBP.
Well, thank you. Let me just start with the name, right? Because as you pointed out, it's not immediately intuitive just what this thing is. And Mass, to any good sociologists, will of course ring familiar because we have, through the better part of the 20th century, lived in a mass society. And one of the consequences of a mass society is that we lose some of our social connections, some of our relationships. And I think that means we need to be more intentional. We need interlocutors to bring people together. But it also harkens back to Thomas Paine's very evocative statement when he wrote, "There's a mass of sense that lies in a dormant state that good government should quietly harness." Mm-hmm. Now, the Canadian idea of peace, order, and good government came after Paine was writing about proto-democracies. But for Canadian years, I also think there's an interesting resonance there. A lot of our work at Mass is about tapping into that dormant state with a public that is often less polarized and much more thoughtful than is publicly portrayed. Mm. Now, if you have such, a high-minded rationale for just the first four letters of your name, what's with the LBP part? That's just a bit of whimsy. Our original slogan was led by people, and that got compressed. But why have we stuck with a name like Mass LBP that is in fact eminently forgettable and obscure? It's because actually when we're doing our work, when we have government clients and we are interacting with members of the public in these assemblies, the last thing anybody needs to be preoccupied with is the fact that they are talking to what is in effect a consultant. We want to blend into the background and try and reduce the distance between citizens and government. If people forget who we are, just fine with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned how, I have trouble memorizing things, especially acronyms. So this LBP, what I've formed a habit of doing is thinking up some silly combination of words. So to remember LBP, I memorized Lion's Beautiful Paws. So,
well. I like that very much.
Led by people would have been fine, but I think Lion's Beautiful Paws, I'll never forget, you see.
Perhaps neither will I.
Okay, so now this is an organization that has, I believe at one point, did I see that you've organized 100 or so either citizens' assemblies or something like it?
Well, that would be a bit of an exaggeration, though we are well on our way. Mass has been around since 2007, which makes us about 17 years old. And in that time, we've completed somewhere on the order of 300 different policy projects for government,
Mhm.
of which 50 approximately have been citizens' assemblies, or what we sometimes refer to as reference panels. And, Mass is, in a sense, a product of a very special moment in Canada. What I think of as really a rip in time from our conventional approach to democracy. And this goes back just a few years before our founding to British Columbia, where the government of the day decided, in the aftermath of a true failure of their electoral system. We have to remember that the government was elected with just 40+% of the vote, and it translated into all but 2 seats in the legislature. It was flagrantly disproportionate. But instead of doing what other governments might have done, that is, establish a royal commission, create a task force of legislators to examine it, for a variety of reasons, Gordon Campbell decided to create a citizens' assembly. It was the first time anything like this had been created at scale. It was replicated 2 years later in Ontario, because in the early 2000s, you did hear a lot of progressive governments talking about electoral reform as part of their mandate. I was attached to the Ontario process, running with colleagues a parallel students' assembly, and that got me a front row seat to the entire operation.
By the way,
And,
where was that? That sounds interesting. A students' assembly. Where and what were you up to there?
well, it was a mirror process to the adult citizens' assembly that was taking place in Ontario. So BC went first. They had a grown-up citizens' assembly. We can talk more about the particulars in British Columbia. Then Ontario and the McGuinty government decided to emulate that process. But they added a students' assembly to hear from future voters. And I was fortunate enough to work with some friends at a organization called Student Vote, which had been trying to run mock elections in high schools across Canada. And we joined up and we designed the Students' Assembly. And, to be perfectly honest, I was intrigued by assemblies, but I wasn't convinced of them by that point. What I really didn't like, however, which was unlike British Columbia, it's how the popular press in Ontario, on both the left and the right, was intensely critical of the very premise of a citizens' assembly.
Really?
Now, in the Toronto Sun, you had columnists like Christina Blizzard saying these are a bunch of nobodies with nothing better to do than give their time to think about electoral reform. You had prominent academics at the University of Toronto, like Nelson Wiseman, calling the whole thing ridiculous. You had columnists even in the Toronto Star saying that they thought the idea of citizen representatives working in such a sophisticated way was preposterous. And I didn't like that. Mm-hmm. So whatever I thought about the merits of the Citizens' Assembly at that time, I really didn't like how those in positions of power, those who are used to being in that privileged slice of society that considers Queen's Park its second home, felt that Ontarians didn't belong there with them. And so that sort of set the bit between my teeth. And ultimately, I decided at the conclusion of the Ontario Citizens' Assembly that we needed to create some kind of organization to try and take that model and actually push it into our democratic culture. And, we've had reasonable, but not uh, uh, disproportionate success in our 17 years at home, but where we have had extraordinary success. And what makes citizens' assemblies Canada's most significant democratic export is the fact that there was a man sitting in the Ontario Citizens' Assembly as a guest of the Assembly to talk about Ireland's electoral system. And David Farrell is an expert on single transferable vote. And he went back to Ireland, a country that had any number of very vexing and intractable political issues. And working with a woman named Jane Souter, decided to take that Canadian Citizens' Assembly model and to ultimately convince the government of the day to run the first bona fide national citizens' assemblies that successfully led to referenda, decriminalizing abortion in Ireland, and legalizing same-sex marriage. So if I walk along the streets of Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver and I say, how about those citizens' assemblies? People won't really know what I'm talking about. If I walk along the streets of Dublin, however, and I say, tell me about those citizens' assembly, everybody in every political party will have a view, and they'll probably have some ideas for the next citizens' assemblies they'd like to see.
And their views will likely be favorable?
Correct. And what Canadians, need to be reminded of, because we often forget our own stories, is that what began in BC and continued in Ontario has now led to something which the OECD has called the deliberative wave. Mm-hmm. More than 700 processes that can trace their genealogy back to that rip in time.
Well, I want to know how it connects to something that was even much more ancient, and that's the Athenian model. But I don't know exactly what went on in BC and Ontario. In what year was that?
2003 and 2006.
Okay. So during that period, I wasn't very conscious. And but so I don't know how it worked. Of course, I belonged to a citizens' assembly, what was called the Helsinki Citizens' Assembly, and it was a very important organization in my life. But I don't think it would qualify as what you have in mind, because it was a voluntary thing. People joined and came if they wanted to, and so it wasn't a delegation of people selected by sortition, which I take to be the defining sine qua non of being a real citizens' assembly. Were those early BC and Ontario citizens' assemblies actually representative of the population or the voters of our provinces, or
very much so? Right? It's quite extraordinary how British Columbia, really as a first mover, managed to establish what remained the definitive standards that distinguish citizens' assemblies from other participatory or dialogic processes. Now, we shouldn't get too hung up on the name citizens' assemblies. When Emmanuel Macron created a citizens' assembly on climate and on physician assistance in dying, in French, it was called a Convention des Citoyens, right? A citizens' convention. And we've seen different nomenclature, commissions in Canada, assemblies, conventions. But maybe for your viewers, let's just set out what are the core elements. Mm-hmm. Though they often work to advance or evaluate a policy proposal, they most closely resemble what in Anglophone countries we would understand as a jury. This is a large jury of typically 40, 60, maybe 100 or more people. Like a jury, the members are randomly selected. Unlike a jury, they are not compelled to serve. Consequently, to ensure that we have a good demographic balance on the jury, we use the process that you just mentioned, sortition. Now, that is a fancy term that we prefer to refer to as a civic lottery. Why? Because we want people to feel good about winning. What does it look like? A government will send out 5, 10, 100,000 letters to randomly selected households. This letter is an invitation to public service. And around the world, the response rate is about 5 to 7, maybe 8%. Now, if you think about just the response rate for public opinion research to answer a survey, it's typically 1 to 3%. And what we're asking for is a good deal more time consuming than a survey, because the ask is to volunteer, typically no fewer than 4, maybe 8, maybe 12 Saturdays over a period of many months. So if I send out 10,000...
Let me interrupt you a moment, because I'm a little preoccupied with what, as a sociologist who was at one time involved in survey research, the notion 1 to 3% is really, really discouraging, because if you want to really have a representative sample, you have to do things like go back time and time and time again to the same household and knock on the door and wheedle to try really hard to get the person that your sampling device picked. Because if you let it to be too voluntary, in fact, ideally we might, like some jury places, you're fully expected to show up. If you don't have you've got to have a really good excuse to get out of jury duty, because if it's not really a high proportion of people agreeing to appear, then it's not representative. And the whole point is to make it, to be able to say this is a representative group of real citizens. So
Right.
do you make a lot of effort to try to get your sample to comply?
So compliance is not, I'm not sure I've ever heard it phrased as compliance, to be honest. What we try and do is everything possible to raise the response rate.
Okay.
And we will remove any barrier or obstacle. So in Europe, at least, people by convention are paid an honorarium. In Canada, for a variety of reasons, generally speaking, they're not. We would take care of childcare, elder care. If there was some sort of evident financial need, we would remove that. What we do is try and lower whatever barriers to participation as possible. But what we found is that, the different randomizing filters that are employed do a very good job of ensuring that both the psychographic and the demographic profile of the members who are ultimately randomly selected in a stratified sample are broadly representative of that community. So we randomly select the households. People amongst themselves decide whether they're going to volunteer. And then we close our eyes and we pick different attributes like age, gender, geography. And then we go into the pool of individuals who would match those criteria and we draw a name.
So it's a stratified random sample.
That's it.
You have a quota for people of certain age distribution and
correct.
Et cetera.
Correct.
Good.
And so then we treat them as though they are elected representatives. Rather than elected, they have been selected. But we're not screening for merit or knowledge or political persuasion. this is an act of public service and volunteerism, and we take very seriously that that person is there not just to advocate for their own views and interests and particularities, though inevitably we all bring our identities and our history and our concerns to the conversation. But we really challenge the members to recognize the fact that there was nothing intrinsically special about them that led them to be selected. And that what they have to do is use their imagination to think about the needs and interests of the 500 other people who volunteered but weren't selected at a minimum, or the 5,000 people standing behind them who received a letter, or the 500,000 people who make up the community. And so this is a really interesting component of the design of an assembly where you are esteeming the role, right? The office that that person is filling, while also decentering the individual to a degree. You know, we're there to support them, to hold them, to give them whatever they need to perform that role. But ultimately, it's about the role and not the individual. And that leads us then to be able to create an assembly whose purpose is to evaluate an issue and reach a rough consensus. And so when you explain these processes to people for the first time, they think it's outrageous, the idea that people would give up 40 hours of their time. People are too busy, too self-involved. They think it's incredible that in our polarized time, that people could possibly find their way to common ground. And, you know, best proof we have of this is that once an assembly begins, nobody drops out. The only reason people leave is because there's a family crisis or something that couldn't be anticipated has happened over the course of the 4 or 6 months during which the assembly is working. And that in virtually every case, there is a strong set of recommendations that do represent the common ground they have identified.
Now, I want to get right down to what is, for me, the real question. I'm concerned about how to improve the governance that we have, because I'm personally convinced that even the most democratic countries in the world are going to the dogs in terms of political decision-making and never mind what all. But I think we really need to do something to fix democracy. And to me, it looks like the question is, if you put it more in the hands of real citizens and admonish them to be really responsible and not just try to vote some sort of stupid party line, that they would do a good job. Now, tell me, the best you know, whether anybody has evaluated the quality of decision making under these various conditions, and whether you could have real confidence that if we had our laws being proposed by coming out of initially the Citizens Assembly, that we'd have better decisions, or at least the decisions would be no worse than they have been lately.
There's a lot there to take up.
Sorry.
I'll say briefly that, you know, in the field of political theory and political science right now, deliberative democracy is amongst one of the most popular topics for young scholars to examine. And there is certainly a growing body of literature that suggests that the quality of deliberation either meets, which I think is a bit of a low bar, or else exceeds the caliber of deliberation that we see in our elected chambers. And that policymakers and political leaders can take confidence that the recommendations made by assemblies are broadly reflective of public opinion when, and this is a key condition, when the public has also had a chance to think about the issue.
Mhm.
You said something interesting a moment ago. You talked about fixing democracy and whether the introduction of more assemblies could help fix democracy. My vision is that at some point in the future, everyone, once in their life, will have the opportunity to serve on a local, a provincial, a national assembly, but only once. Or maybe they're only going to know somebody who's done it once. Because I actually think these processes are very complementary with our existing system of representative democracy.
Oh.
They aren't a replacement for it.
Well, now hold on, because there are people who, I'm thinking now of David von Rebelbook, who writes a book called Against Elections. Isn't that the title? If it's not his, it's somebody else's, because he's really saying, and I think some of the other scholars like Alain Landemont are convinced that really some of the worst problems that we have nowadays come out of the fact that we have elections at all, that the party is running things and people, vote whatever they're told that way instead of thinking. So you want to keep representative democracy, but just fancy it up a bit, right?
Well, fancy it up a bit would, I think, significantly diminish the ambition of what I have in mind. I did want to get back to that word fixed democracy, though.
Okay.
Because
broken.
I think many people would agree with you. But I don't think we improve democracy by fixing it. We improve democracy by growing it. And I think part of the challenge of contemporary democracy, and it's not, I'm not trying to be semantic about this. It's that for the better part of 300 plus years, we have been engaged in an all-out battle simply to ensure that every human being has the right to vote. And you know what an arduous task that has been in our country, and how into the 90s we were still enfranchising federal inmates, people who served on the judiciary, those with developmental disabilities. And still, a fifth of our population cannot do what the rest of us have come to regard as the absolute basis of democracy, because we have yet to franchise children. But our imagination about the role people can play largely stops there. Part of what I find
you just started boggling my mind. I'm trying. All of a sudden, I'm thinking about going to nursery schools and running. Sorry. Why did you do that to me? I was thinking, and now I can't do anything but feel stunned.
I'll put that in a parentheses. I would abolish the voting age tomorrow. I think people should be able to vote when they feel good and ready to vote.
Okay.
My 4-year-old daughter has strong opinions about things, as many 4-year-olds do. I am sure that she is capable of exercising a kind of public judgment that also, as someone with hopefully the next 80 or 90 years ahead of her, living in the society, I think that voice deserves formal political expression.
I remember when my son was 4 years old. It was about that age when he said to me, "Mommy, what are we? Elephants or donkeys?" And I said, "We're donkeys." And so he's been a donkey ever since. He's been a Democrat, if anything, and probably not a very active one because he lives in Canada. But
this is a digression, but we constantly wring our hands about voter turnout and young people. The simplest thing we could do is let them vote.
Okay, touche. We'll march on. Listen, let's go back to Athens, if you will. because for I looked it up, 185 years, Athens had the kind of system of government that you've been describing. Only it certainly wasn't representative. I mean, it wasn't. You didn't elect your legislators. It really was a government by the people, and every day ordinary citizens would show up and find out what their assignment was. They'd line up and they'd find out, well, this room, now you're supposed to go to this room and you're on that committee today, etc. And this went on and it worked. At least it worked for a very, very long time during Athens's greatest period. And there were elements of democracy in some of the other Greek states too. But it really worked for Athens, and they didn't even seem to have an official administrative thing. One of the interesting things that I would want to explore is what should be the domain of these assemblies, whatever you want to call them. How much authority should they have? Should they make general policy? I've heard, for example, I've just been reading the most wonderful book called Keys to Democracy by Maurice Pope, the late Maurice Pope, an Oxford classics professor who got interested because of Athens. And he was describing how things worked there and his evaluation of how it should work, because he was promoting the whole idea for modern times as well. And he didn't seem to make a distinction between the administrative staff, that is the mayor and the office of the people who run the sewers and the electricity and the garbage collection and all these other things that go on in a city, the staff, professional maintenance. He didn't seem to distinguish that level of decision making, the administrative thing, from the general policies. Whereas I believe that many other people thinking and writing would say that it works well as a system for making general policies for a long period of time, or where there's a controversy and where you have to reconcile different points of view. But it would not be a very good method of deciding, well, what streets are we going to wash this week, and which ones, how often should we wash the streets, etc. Or, what about the trees on this road? Do they need to be cut down or whatever? So that kind of decision making should be done by professionals, as opposed to paid people whose job it is to find out the best possible way of doing your garbage collection or something. So the technical things.
Well, I think that's true. As others have said, you don't ask a parliamentary committee to design an airplane, and you don't ask a citizens' assembly to design an airplane either. However, you can ask a parliamentary committee and you can ask a citizens' assembly to determine some of the environmental regulations that might surround the use of airplanes, because they produce noise, GHG emissions, they have an impact on the economic development of neighborhoods to the detriment of others. Citizens' assemblies are a mechanism to exercise public judgment that takes into account our values, that weighs those values against different priorities, and ultimately makes it possible to exercise what Daniel Yankelevich called public judgment. So where there's a need for public judgment, where there's a need for direction and guidance and consensus, then we can use an assembly or another political mechanism. You mentioned Maurice Pope's wonderful book, something I hope will be taken up by many of your viewers. I'm not an expert in ancient Athens. I am almost intentionally ignorant of how sortition was employed in Athens, because I find it too fantastic and too distant and exotic a reference when what I want citizens' assemblies to feel is contemporary, practical, every day. I will
Okay, now,
nevertheless.
but there are real questions about not just contemporary, but I'm thinking of future oriented. I'm thinking big in terms of major changes. And already, I think I ran ahead of you on a couple of issues. I mean, I was more radical than you when we had our little chat the other day. On 2 points I can think of at least. One has to do with the notion of global, whether you could have a global citizens assembly. You seemed not to think that was a realistic thing to do, whereas I think that's the whole name of the game, is to try to get there so that we avoid having things done by people who represent things within borders, and have a population without borders be the whole global population from which we try to get our representative delegates. So I'm really interested in your and elaborate why you think that's not possible, because I would certainly want to work toward that full speed.
Well, first, I'd recommend to you and to your viewers a recent book from last year by the French academic Yves Sintomer. And the book is called, it's a wonderful title, The Government of Chance, Sortition and Democracy from Athens to the Present.
Mm-hmm.
And Yves has done, I think, a real service to this movement by properly tracing the genealogy of these ideas in the space between Athens and the present day. And I won't do justice to his book, but one important juncture that he points to is when, at the birth of the modern world, we came not to value chance, but to actually work to suppress the role of chance in public affairs. And the reason why I think this is important is that ultimately, any democratic process is one that has to manufacture legitimacy. And what's legitimate? Well, what other people regard as being legitimate. And while I think many people find attractive the idea of randomly selecting folks to advise government on various topics, the idea of elected politicians simply being replaced by chance, by randomly selected people, at least from where we stand right now, feels like a leap too far. I think Hélène and David have important, radical ideas that stretch our democratic imaginations.
Mm-hmm.
What I have heard less about, there are two concerns. One, an elaborated mechanism for political accountability. And secondly, how we avoid many of the same pathologies that creep into our partisan environments from also emerging when you have randomly selected groups of people who aren't simply performing a one-off, but might be sitting together, deliberating on a range of issues over many months or years. I think part of what
I think that you're bringing a whole bunch of things in. Let's take this question of accountability, because I think it's obviously very important. If you can't get a broom and get rid of the idiots, then you're stuck. However,
throw the bums out.
Yeah, and it is true that if you don't have elections, you can't unelect somebody and get rid of them. However, the answer, I saw a video in which this issue was brought up, and the answer that I think it was Hugh Pope gave, or I could be mistaken. Hugh was being the son of Maurice Pope, who who wrote the book and died before it was published. So Hugh is his son and is sort of the advocate for the idea these days. And I believe his answer was, look, the people in the Citizens Assembly themselves have a set of accountability, systems of accountability, in that they get to know each other and they know that so-and-so is an out-and-out jerk. Everything he says is stupid, and they marginalize those people. So the people who come to the fore in making decisions in the assembly tend to be the people who have been considered adequate and cooperative and sensible by the other members of the group, and that is where the accountability enters. I hadn't thought of that as a system of accountability, but it does have. You can argue anyway that it has a lot of merit as a way of weeding out stupid ideas. On the other hand, there is the opposite threat, which worries me probably even more, which is that there's such a thing as group dynamics, and that a group, when people like each other, they tend to want to conform to each other's expectations and go along with and be nice about what other people say. So there's a possibility of an idea catching on and a stupid idea being accepted just because everybody likes to be on the same side because they want to be popular with each other. And of course, during the 70s, there was a guy named Irving Janis who wrote a lot about that danger. He actually looked at some of the decisions that had been made in Kennedy's government. He compared how Kennedy's response to the Bay of Pigs was challenged, was done in comparison with the somewhat later Cuban Missile Crisis, where apparently he had learned from the mistake of the first one not to listen too much to his counsel as long as they were all of one body. So he divided them up and made them into subgroups so that they'd come up with contradictory opinions, and then he would put them back together and see what they could come up with then. But he was trying to encourage diversity and with the awareness that too much solidarity within a group can be a source of bad decision making. So there are two different threats, it would seem to me. One being a threat, and the other one is a solution from the same kind of logic. What do you say about all that?
I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, the whole reason why I'm such a believer in citizens' assemblies is that I think we need to bring more people to sit at the table and to grapple with the very consequential issues that concern us all, and around which there seems to be increasingly less agreement on. Mm-hmm. So I think this is a terrific mechanism that can help our system of representative democracy, our electeds, do a better job. And I think we are grossly overweighted in putting too much emphasis, too much power on those electeds, and not enough around tapping into the human capability that's all around us. You know, paradoxically, our problem is not scarcity. We always say, oh, well, the public's apathetic, they're self-interested, they won't turn out. Our problem in modern democracies that are well-educated, well-resourced, is a problem of abundance. We have so much human talent and so much capability. It is our society's best asset, and politically, we leave it benched. We continue to act as though we can run government from the left or the right, largely without people, except those who show up every 4 years. We have a government of losers in first-past-the-post systems because nobody has won a more than 20% of eligible voters, even when they constitute a majority government. And so we have a fiction of majoritarianism. We have a fiction of mandates. And I think it requires much greater humility on the part of our elected leaders to recognize the limits of their mandate and the utility of tapping in to the public. But make no mistake, we need better ways to do it, because surveys, town halls, these are dreadful mechanisms largely for properly accessing that talent. Now, the bit about legitimacy, as you described, I think you're right. Within an assembly, people do recognize who's contributing value and maybe who is detracting from the quality of deliberations, and they respond accordingly. But if you're sitting outside of that assembly and you're like, I just don't like where any of this is going, what are you to do except sit on your hands? Mm-hmm. One of the things that I think our focus on consensus and finding agreement and collaboration often occludes is the reality of political conflict. That we need to take up this challenge of those who see politics as an antagonistic arena. Mm-hmm. And we need to have better theories of conflict when we're thinking about how these consensus-based processes can play a role in our political architecture. The last thing I'll say on this is that we can't be naive also to the corruptibility of any human process. Mm-hmm. Our electoral systems are facing considerable challenge from malign, authoritarian regimes who want to reduce confidence in the system of democracy that we have. If we can corrupt a judiciary, if we can corrupt a government, if we can capture a parliament, make no mistake, we can absolutely corrupt or manipulate a citizens' assembly. And so we have to be mindful of their limits, and they don't exist in another political plane.
Hold on, come back here, because I'm on your side up to that point. I would think you got to think of the ways in which you can corrupt people, but the main source of corruption is money. If the problem with elected legislators is they got to get elected and reelected and reelected. And the minute they get into office, they have to start figuring out how to get money for the next election and how to stay on good terms with the guys in the party who are going to make the fateful decisions, et cetera. So there's a lot that goes on there that is a source of corruption that would be absent in the kind of system that you've been promoting. Come back here and fight harder for your system, guy. Don't give it away so easily.
Two of the best things we could do, of course, in countries like the United States that have been overrun by moneyed interests, is to have a citizens' assembly on campaign finance reform and have a citizens' assembly on electoral boundaries. There'd be perfect processes to think about the broader public interest and provide guidance.
Well, and wherever you are, getting elected is you. There's all kinds of opportunity there for people, as you pointed out, to corrupt any system. But it's sure a lot easier to corrupt a system that's run by parties and by moneyed interests than it is a system that is run by just picking a name out of a hat and saying, now you're the head of the organization.
Obviously, I believe citizens' assemblies have many salutary benefits, and they exemplify a lot of the principles and practices that we want more of in our democracy. But if we were to take the new president of Argentina or Viktor Orban in Hungary, who are leading, I guess, what is now called illiberal democracies, Orban can create a folk assembly tomorrow, frame the question in a particular way, invite in a certain range of experts, and randomly select citizens to serve. And I'm sadly convinced that the result of that public deliberation would probably be a series of very illiberal policies that we would find very uncomfortable. So
You've
all I'm
just
saying is
given
that
away the game, man. I can't play with you anymore. I was on your side, but the whole name of the game for me is to say that we can improve on the system of government we have by developing citizens' assemblies, and
correct.
we will eliminate a lot of the room for exactly that kind of thing to happen.
But
Now, if you don't think it's possible, then I got to go find somebody else to talk to.
uh,
We don't have anything in
look,
common anymore.
most of the world doesn't live in democracies, right? And yet
I'm
we
trying
should
to
still
fix
be
that.
trying to,
I'm trying to fix that. I want it.
right.
I
But
want
just
a
because
world.
people,
I want a world government that is run by people who are randomly selected, stratified random sample of the human population. Yes. And we can even start doing that right now. Anybody with a cell phone has the capacity to function at a distance in a deliberative assembly by Zoom. We could hold these we could have deliberations all over the world all the time at almost no choice. It's costing me very little to run this conversation today, almost nothing. And I'll publicize it, and it will get to reach 1,000 people at least, or probably more. So a lot of people are going to hear this, and it's. I'm glad. I really hope they do. But I want to plant the idea that we could do it all over the world with lots of people talking about the same issues and really getting closer to having a global citizens assembly that makes real decisions comparable to what the UN General Assembly makes, only be much better structure. Okay? You got
but
5 minutes in which to answer me.
first of all, the United Nations obviously does not make binding decisions that impact domestic policies and the course of national governments in most instances. I'm going to put aside the aspirations of global democracy and world government because there are better, more thoughtful people on that topic. The point I was trying to make around voting, however, is that just because um, ballot boxes get stuffed, electoral results get ignored, just because we have to send election monitors to much of the world to try and ensure the integrity of these processes, does not mean that we shouldn't be wholly consumed with trying to see that free and fair elections are afforded as a right to all humans. And similarly, just because a citizens' assembly could be torqued by an autocrat doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying to see that part of the democratic experience for more people is to take up the responsibility of thinking for the long-term interests of their communities and those they care about. What we need to do in the 21st century is expand our democratic imagination to recognize the human capacity and capability that exists, and to create venues and mechanisms to take up that talent and to put it to good and democratic use.
Okay. So I mean, I was half baiting you on purpose to be provocative, but uh, I do think we probably have different aspirations to some extent. That is, I'm really glad you're doing what you're doing in Canada, and I really hope it becomes, 1,000 times bigger and more important and more influential and so on. But mainly, my reason for being interested in that possibility is that it would be contagious. If people could see that you could run a national government by taking very seriously the recommendations, if not actually making binding the recommendations of citizens' assemblies in that country, then they're going to say, yeah. And in fact, I think they've already started saying it in Europe. The EU has some things going that are transnational, international. I'm sure you know more about it than I do, but I know they have something like a citizens' assembly for the EU coming along. And I believe Facebook has said that we've got a pretty good sample of the human population. I don't know, they've got a good fraction of us that are members of Facebook. They can sample Facebook members and ask them all kinds of questions if they want to put together, and I've heard that some of them are talking about doing this, put together a citizens' assembly for people to do things like Zoom conferences all over the world from Facebook members. Boy, there we'd really be cooking then. That's the kind of thing I'm looking forward to, but that go beyond national borders. Frankly, I don't like nation states. I think, okay, we got them. We're not going to get rid of them right away, but I think they cause more trouble than they solve, because most of the wars are caused by the quest for territory, for land that's marked by certain borders, and it doesn't do us any favor. What's going on between Ukraine and Russia right now, or between Gaza and Israel right now, there's perfect examples of the results of having nation states when we really should look at people. And that's what I'm looking forward to. So you have a few minutes in which to rebut everything that I believe in.
I'm not going to attempt that. I'm simply going to observe that I think right now the nature of our democratic crisis is largely domestic, and it is bounded by nation states. And what we have is a different way of thinking about the public as a resource rather than a risk. What we have are the advent of mechanisms, of which citizens' assemblies are but one, to create something closer to a high energy, engaged, democratic society that puts to use the talents and capabilities of vastly more people. And that many of the things we're laboring under, the belief that people are disengaged and disinterested and polarized, is largely a function of some anti-democratic sentiments and forces that remain at work within our societies. And that democracy, to quote the great poet Bob Dylan, is either busy being born or it's busy dying. And we can't make our work to address the democratic crisis simply a valorization of the status quo. We need to get busy being born and busy bringing more people to the table in a much more substantive and profound way.
Hooray for you. And put me on your mailing list. I actually subscribed, but I don't know whether or not I can find out more as you put together various projects, which, sometime I'd like to even explore that here. What are these things that you put together, that you do, that you organize, and how are they going? And I'd like to know more. But can we do you mind putting your web address at the end? I'll put it so people can sign up and get your newsletter.
masslbp.com. There's a resources page where there are videos and guides and reports, a wealth of materials. Virtually everything we make, we put in the public domain.
God bless you for what you're doing. I really support fully everything, as far as I know, that you've done or look like you're going to do. And my hope is that it turns out to be bigger than you really intend for it to be, and that everybody catches on to the idea that this is a good way of doing things, and we could apply it globally. So that I wind up winning.
Well, hopefully in this lifetime or the next, Meta.
All right. Blessings.
Thank you for your time this afternoon.
I've enjoyed it so much. You carry on. Okay?
Bye-bye.
Bye. Project Save the World produces these forums. This is episode 583. Watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. People share information there about 6 global issues and we welcome your comments too. To find a particular talk show, check the scroll list on the homepage or use the search bar. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine, which now serves as a free of charge newsletter to organizations to help mobilize knowledge about 6 global threats to humankind. We gladly email the magazine as a PDF or link to any interested organization in the world that works to prevent a global catastrophe involving war and weapons, global warming, famine, pandemics, radioactive contamination, or cyber risks. Just email us at office@peacemagazine.org, and we'll add your group's email address without charge to our list. Please type "Subscribe my group" as the subject of your email. For individual subscriptions at $20 Canadian per year, go to pressreader.com on your browser and search for Peace Magazine.